All right, welcome everybody to part 2 of this really interesting conversation with Dr. Rivas on racism and the Latino culture. I'm here once again with my co-host Alejandro and Dr. Martha Rivas. Thank you again for coming to San Bernardino to our office to do this episode. We touched on some really interesting topics already in part 1, so check it out if you haven't already. Watch that first and then come back to this episode because we're going to touch on some interesting topics like the anti-indigenous ideologies within the Latino community. So let's just get right into it. Dr. Rivas, can you talk about more about the anti-indigenous ideologies within the Latino culture?
Absolutely. And again, connected to the part one of this recording is understanding that there was the intentional ways to disconnecting us from our indigenous roots and knowledge and history. And I often say anti-indigenous simply because, all of us have an indigenous root. Yo soy de Michoacán, yo soy purépecha. I didn't really embrace and understand the power that comes with that until I was like in my 20s, from going to UCLA, taking Chicana and Chicano studies, and then asking my dad, ¿qué pasó? Like, how come we weren't taught this history?
Man, our parents don't tell us anything.
But our parents, and rightly so, I think part of our parents, why they often choose not to tell us some of these histories that they actually do know, is because, as my dad would tell me, en ese país no quieren que conozcamos todo eso. Mm-hmm. Like, he would be vigilant and be like, this country isn't going to value that. This country doesn't want you to know that. So I'm not going to tell you it. But even in the way that our parents experienced, like in my case, coming to this country, and legacies beforehand, because we've been in this country for hundreds of years, right? I talk about the artificial border that is what we now call the U.S.-Mexico border. But the Southwest, we were Mexico. We were Mexico prior to this border, and it was indigenous land always and still is. And so that connection to even make those statements is power in and of itself. But I say indigenous because oftentimes when people talk Native American, right, labels, important. In this country, Native American equate to only those tribes that were recognized by the U.S. treaties, U.S. treaties. So if you're not in those treaties, no te van a reconocer. They're not going to acknowledge you. And so for me, it's important to say I'm not going to use Native American per se, because I really want to talk about everyone's indigeneity. We have indigenous roots, and it spans from all over the world. But when we acknowledge that, that gives us power. But we were born into a society that we're supposed to devalue it. And it goes back to some of the novelas or some of the películas. Who are the maids? Indigenous women.
Yeah.
Dark women. Who are the ones who are supposed to be serving, or the ones who are perceived as not smart enough? And is all these derogatory messages of within the Latino community is, again, the separation, the intentional separation from that. Because, again, you separate to connect to whiteness.
Like La India Maria?
See? And it becomes like a joke, right? It's like, oh, nomás, no sabe hablar bien. And it's like, well, intentionally, it's a character I grew up with, but it's sort of the intentionality of what was the message behind it. What was the intent? And I think that's part of us having this conversation, is that there was a very direct intent as to why we had to disconnect.
Yeah.
And it goes back to power structures, the power ideology, and internalizing some of these ideas.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think it touches on your question about what decolonialism is and what that would look like. And I think a lot of that is starting with having these conversations around anti-indigenous feelings, ideologies within our own community and culture. I'm currently reading right now the Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown, which is a historical book around telling the story of the Native Americans. They were recognized under those treaties, and what they saw and all the violence that they saw fighting the colonial settlers of the U.S. Army. So I'm learning a lot about that history now. Yeah. I've tried to talk to my parents so much about what our history was back in San Lorenzo, Michoacán, un ranchito.
Yeah.
But they're so tight-lipped about that.
Yeah.
I literally have to pry things out of them. Just found out recently that my great-grandma fought in the Mexican Revolution. I'm like, that's awesome, Mom. Why didn't you tell me this for so long? That would have been so cool to know.
Absolutely.
So just little by little, I'm trying to really understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah. And it's interesting because that's for all the classes I teach. I've taught at all segments, community college, CSU, UC. Right now I'm teaching at Cal State Dominguez Hills. I've been teaching for going on 5 years. And so all of the classes I teach, the final project is always about, what is your history? You need to document your history because these books aren't going to do it. And so ask your parents, ask your abuelita, ask your tia, what are the stories that haven't been told? Because it's our responsibility to document it. And so now, I've taught thousands of students, but it's really about what is that method for us to say our histories have not been written. And if they have, it hasn't been by people that really know our stories. So how about we give space for our parents and our grandparents and our tias to really tell us what they believe and what they remember, and then we document it. Because those of us who go have access to higher ed is very few of us still. So we have a responsibility of what we do with those tools, right? Writing. But you mentioned a book. I think one of the books I often recommend folks, and unfortunately he just passed away 2 weeks ago. It's Roberto Dr. Cintley Rodriguez, and his book came out. He has countless numbers of books, but he spoke about, for us to really know who we are, we have to go back to el maíz, corn. Because corn was what flourished this entire world. And that came from us, from our gente. And so his most recent book was titled, and if I get this wrong, I'll make sure to send it out to you all. But
we'll fix it on the notes.
It's writing among gringos, más o menos, for 50 years. That's his title, like writing among gringos, más o menos, for 50 years. And because he was a journalist, and he was a Chicano activist, and he was beaten up by the cops in LA, and that was traumatizing. So he wrote a lot about what that meant for Chicano, individual, and as a scholar. And like, again, his attempt by publishing this book is to be able to, for us folk, to realize how rich our history has been and how present we've been in this entire phenomena of the country's evolution. And that's ultimately what we're here to honor, right? Is that we have a longer history. And so this whole notion of anti-indigenous is for us to disconnect from history, disconnect from that root. And so you mentioned earlier that historical amnesia, it's precisely that, is that we become sort of de donde somos, like some people say de aquí y de allá, or no soy de aquí y no soy de allá. And I write myself, and I often say, es que no somos de aquí y no somos de todo.
I feel like
Somos
you just read my mind.
todito. We're all of it. We're all of it. And part of that is embracing that indigeneity. It's like, what are the roots? Where are we coming from?
I want to ask you to centralize this question with the Inland Empire.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, and you live in Riverside, do you feel like there's been a shift, at least maybe within the last couple of years, that folks have been more socially aware of injustices happening around our space? Do you think that the IE is shifting into a better place to recognize the anti-indigenous and the anti-blackness within our community here in the Inland Empire?
I'm going to say no.
You can be truthful.
I'm going to be real.
By all means, yeah.
I mean, I'm going to be real. I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no simply because I returned to the Inland Empire as to become a dean at the community college sector. That was my dream, right? I always wanted just be an administrator so I could change the system. And in that space and that opportunity, I was able to be in different spaces, in community, different sectors, y la política, what am I hearing? What am I really, really listening to? And it's folks who are still complacent to uphold oppression in a very subtle way. But, there's folks like me that were like, what do you really mean by this? Because we still have administrators and faculty who say, these students are this and that. I'm like, well, you know what? Come back and tell me what these students really mean.
Or there's even like more explicit, educators and just people in general out here. Like a couple of years ago with that one teacher who, in Riverside,
North
I think.
High School.
Yeah, like the one who dressed like an Indian or Native American, and she danced around in an offensive way. And, that she's not an outlier. She's like partially the majority of like this purple bubble. Like there are people like her who think like that. They just don't say it like she does.
Well, some do.
And some do.
Yeah.
Like you'll see flags like "Don't tread on me," or you'll see people who are like "Back the blue." But like, what do you really mean by that? Like, why do you have to feel like there's such a big need for police and policing in our community?
They just want to make America great again.
Yeah, exactly. And
it was never great.
The thing is that, but you see these pockets of like real hard conservatism pull up. Like when you start having some folk like myself, for example, live up on the hill. I jokingly talked about, I live in Riverside, I live up on the hill, and God forbid, there's Chicanas up on the hill because there's that ideology, right? In terms of, you're changing things up. You're like, how were you able to come up? Well, I have these degrees, and yes, this is privilege, but I'm going to call you out on your deficit ideologies of how you're still trying to oppress our folk. And, I briefly spoke, 6 years in public school for my kids, and I already have demoted 2 principals and 4 teachers. Why? Because I'm not tolerating you, not just for my children's sake, but our community doesn't deserve to have these folks with racist ideologies that continue to say, I could yell at them, I'm going to yell at them because they're those kids. No, you can't yell at my kids this way. And I'm talking about my entire community. But I think it goes back, and I'm going to connect it back to this idea of what are our parents' experience, right? And so generations for us experienced this backlash of the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the folks that were staying in the Southwest, the promise was they could speak speak Spanish, keep their property, live life as they were. But that was false. Right? Les quitaron la casa. They took their land. They forced them to speak English.
Like Dodger Stadium?
Yeah, like Dodger Stadium. Chavez Ravine. I have still not set foot in Dodger Stadium because the historicity of the land, it speaks to me. I'm not going to go on there, and everyone has their politica. But if you know the history behind what they did to our folk, like literally dragged them out of their house to demolish their house, that's just like, again, mistreating them like como si nada. But the point I'm trying to make is that generations, going back to the whole language concept, is that it was illegal for you to speak Spanish. Like, you're going to be reprimanded. You're going to get beaten. You're going to, in schools, like, we're going to butcher your name. You're not Eduardo. You're going to become Eddie or this other form of mispronouncing your name. You're not Alejandro. You're Alex, or you're not Marta, you're Martha, because there's an age. There's an age serves a purpose, But it's that butchering of your name, because that's the most personal thing we've ever have is our names. But for us to accept the mispronunciation of our names is like, oh, well, we're going to be, it's okay. Estamos en otro país. Yeah. And that's how our parents felt, right? Estamos en otro país. Yeah. Or la maestra sabe mejor. Like, whatever the teacher says, like, you need to follow. And, luckily I had some really good teachers, but again, it goes back to what's the legacy? What was permissible? And so now we have a legacy of a lot of kids not knowing Spanish or butchering or Spanglish. And now we're critiquing them and attacking. I was like, no, but let's go back to the history of language in this country. Like, a lot of folk, 50, 60-year-olds don't know Spanish as well. So I know it varies depending on immigration status and like regions and how recent y todo eso, because that's the beauty of our community. Yeah. It is nuanced. It is diverse. But I think for me, specifically in the role that I play and the work that I do, is to acknowledge that there's a history behind it. And it's my responsibility to, to share that with all of us here. But it's also for us to acknowledge that it's not just 10 years ago. We're talking about entrenched, real deep history.
And there's even like media documenting it, like recent media, like Flaming Hot, that it's a fun and kind of campy like depiction of the history of how hot Cheetos were made, but like the reality of it is that it's very local. It's an IE thing. Mm-hmm. And like people don't acknowledge the fact that like hot Cheetos are like very Hispanic or Latino, but apart from that, like the person who created them was relatively, and is still alive, but like relatively, like that wasn't that long ago. Like that wasn't like 100 years ago. That was like maybe 40, 50 years. Yeah, like, if you think about it, people would yuck our food. They would be like, oh, like what's that? When we would be eating like a burrito of like beans or like tacos or something, like they would yuck our food. They would call it disgusting. They would call it like some dumb name or whatever, and then they'll be like,
now look at them.
Yeah, now look at them.
They're trying to profit off it.
Now they're trying to like pass off
rolling everything in hot Cheeto crumbs,
spa water, elote salad or whatever they call it.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I don't know if how many folks have seen the movie Walkout, right? That's a historical movement that happened, the Chicano movement. But those elements are still very relevant, like in terms of the burritos, and like the schools would, like children would make fun of kids that would bring burritos to school. But that's also part of, going back to my argument, is that's part of a tool to make you feel less than, make you feel like I'm not performing as I'm supposed to be performing. I'm not eating what I'm supposed to be eating based on how the school is defining this dominant culture to be. And those are the steps that we really define what what we call the dominant narrative in this country has been. Like, if you don't perform according to like these standards in these cultures, which are European standards, then you're going to be seen less than. Yeah. So it goes back to the anti-indigenous, anti-blackness. Like, we can't connect. We don't want to connect. Yeah. Because we're being told this narrative up here of how we're supposed to behave. And that's ultimately the reason why schools function the way they do. Because schools are supposed to assimilate all of us to this dominant culture. We spoke briefly prior to this, the difference between assimilation and acculturation.
Like a melting pot, and like the the cultural narrative of how a melting pot is, where everything has to blend together and has to be like this one dish. But the reality of it is that the way we can thrive is if we see our culture as like a buffet. There's all these different dishes that like are uniquely and ethnically different, and that that's fine, like because you can take a piece of everything and you can still enjoy it, as opposed to getting like this like goulash of one identity.
Mm-hmm. Yep, but I think it goes back to like when we think of these concepts as tools, right? The assimilation is just the word itself. You're going to assume the dominant culture, the dominant language, the dominant ways of life as your own, but you have to reject your own. Mm-hmm. So you're assuming the dominant. Whereas acculturation is you're going to acquire a second or a third or a fourth culture, but honor your own. And that's the distinction, right? How they work. In this country, as I mentioned, schooling became the assimilationist way. It was informed by assimilationist theory. Like, we want our children to butcher their names. We want our children to think they're minority when we're not. We're minoritized. We're the majority now. And we're going to make them speak and think that English is the only language in this country, which is not. And so all these false narratives created the dominant narrative. So this detachment to our indigenous connection, our connection to blackness, todo eso, like, we're going to do everything to tell you not to embrace it.
And I can think of one specific example in the school system, which is everybody in fourth grade here, I think at least in California, has to create a mission.
Oh, they're doing away with it actually now.
Okay, well, that's great. Yeah, that's awesome. Uh-huh. But when I was growing up, everybody had to do a mission in fourth grade. And nobody really, as a fourth grader, understood all of the context behind that, right? And the assimilation part of being okay with creating a mission that destroyed Native Americans and indigenous people in this part of the world. So
I mean, the missions as a tool of it's organized religion, and we spoke about that briefly in terms of coupled with what we grew up in and what we believed was also about coexisting with organized institutionalized religion. So many of us, I know I was born into a Catholic family for generations were. And that's just the way it is. And for me now, it's sort of it is the way it is because organized religion was also a tool to perpetuate this idea of white supremacy, like a white God, when in reality it wasn't. And like missions to destroy indigenous communities and teach them that they have to believe and act a certain way. So again, for me, it's if we break it down to tools, like what's the intent of doing this? It's to oppress. And for us to believe this stuff.
So Dr. Rivas, I think that leads into us for the next question here and potentially our last one, which is how does the concept of nativity intersect with immigration?
Yeah, and I think it's an important question in terms of, the nativeness, right? Nativity, that's what it means. Nativeness is how native are we to this land? And it goes back to my former statement in terms of, I call it the artificial border, the U.S., what we call now the U.S.-Mexico border specifically. I want to address the north border because we often don't forget to acknowledge that there is the Canadian and U.S. border on top. But in terms of the south border, when we really think about why does it exist, the Treaty of Hidalgo, when I often teach and I show the map, the visual map of the original Southwest being Mexico, I'm not surprised, but people are so taken aback by why is this the first time I see this map? And I say this not just in the classes that I teach, but I also do a lot of pláticas with community members. So we're talking 15-year-olds to 85-year-olds. Y señoras mayores, like, they didn't know that. Like, they'd lived here for 50 years and they never knew that history was rich and that it really existed. So for me, it's that epiphany of saying, let's really problematize what it means to immigrate. Because immigration is different than migration. Most of our folk migrated. We just moved. And migration, immigration, that's a basic human right. We have a right to move where we need to survive. And that's oftentimes the cases for folks who come to this country now, across the border here, is because there's push-pull factors, right? What's pushing them out of their country and pulling them into el norte, because that's the pull factor, right? This promise of the better opportunity, promise of all these resources. But what are we not saying about what's happening in their home country, especially right now? As we speak right now, there's a lot of folk coming in from Central America, South America, from Africa, from Ethiopia, and they're coming in through the south border. And so what does that mean? is that we don't problematize the fact that, for example, in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, their vegetation is dead. Like, they can't cultivate resources porque la tierra, it's gone because of climate, the global warming. And so we don't ever talk about environmental racism that's happening there that's pushing them to come. Porque no hay de otra. And so when we talk about the influx of immigration right now, we forget to have the humanity in that discussion. And I think that's what we often forget because of all this, how the U.S. government wants to talk about immigration and immigration reform, and it's just population control. How many people can we actually have in this country? But they forget, this country, this land, we're native to this land. This is our land. We're just moving within the land. But there's a state-sanctioned border that was imposed. And so la política becomes that much more complicated because we do have processes that have to be followed. But again, it's a tool. And so when we talk about your question, nativity, it's really to understand who were folk that were here. Where was the state-sanctioned border imposed? What are the policies now that have to be followed? We went through a process, have to convince that we were good enough to be residents. And now I became a citizen simply so I could get scholarships. I'll be honest. I didn't want to become a citizen, but I had to because it's a tool, right? Once we understand that there's processes that become tools, pues aunque no quiera, I got to do this because I need to, fund my PhD. And it's about how do we navigate this world? How do we navigate our own life? And we don't talk about immigrant or migrant experiences as a navigational resilience. We have so much resilience in our community, but we often just say, no, vamos a poner acá. We're going to point fingers and we're going to say who belongs to. It's a basic human right. And so now we do a lot of work to offer resources and information and all the good work that you're all doing to advocate, to say we have dignity, we need respect, we need to be seen as equals, but we're up against this monster called white supremacy, called racism, called oppression. And so it's not an easy conversation. I know that we don't have a whole lot of time, but I think for us is to be privy to understand, let's not fall victims to just start pointing fingers.
Yeah.
Because it's really about how do we start seeing each other as equals.
Yeah.
Somos humanos. Like, we need to be able to speak to that as well.
Especially since the border crossed us. We never crossed the border.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would be remiss as well, since you mentioned white supremacy and then colonialism, to also mention capitalism too, as sort of like the big umbrella that houses all of these oppressive tools.
Absolutely.
And I think for the Latino community, there's really a fork in the road for people when it comes to assimilation, where sometimes people just fully dive into this, back the blue. Mm-hmm. I'm going to just blend in with my white neighbors, and then there's other folks that are like resistant against that, right? And I feel like my family has fallen in between both camps. Some family has been totally assimilated and believes in, MAGA and that kind of ideology. But my other side of the family is like, F that.
Yeah. Right.
So
but that speaks to the complexity, as you alluded to. It's the why. Yeah. Like, why did they completely assimilate? And it becomes a way to survive, because they've been bombarded with all these ideas that you have to act and perform accordingly to a certain belief system. And so I vamos, right? And we're going to, someone, I was part of a committee of talking about like, how does it make sense to have Latinos for Trump? And it's like, because of this internalized ideology that, this is white supremacy and we're okay with it without calling it white supremacy. Yeah. But it's because it's that assimilation is a way of saying, this is the way this country runs.
And some people just kind of got really used to seasoning their beans with boots.
Yeah. I mean, people don't understand that there's white supremacy all over the world, not just in, Germany or up in Washington, D.C. It exists in Mexico.
Yeah.
There's a strong Nazi movement happening within Mexico. And of course, we can talk about Argentina ad nauseum, but it exists in South America as well.
So. But a lot of it did start out here in the Mexican-American border in Texas with the gasoline baths. And that inspired the Nazis in Germany. Yeah. And that continued everything.
I'm glad you bring that up,
The American Empire really did continue and start a lot of that, sadly.
Google Operation Paperclip, everybody.
Even that, like terminology, right? It's the U.S., like what U.S. did to Native American, Black, like Mexicanos, because we talk about the Holocaust of 100 million Native folk that were here on this land, and then we talk about enslavement. Enslavement is not just African folk. indigenous, Mexicanos, Asian, everyone was enslaved. And so it's really the attempt to extinct folk of color. And so, we talk about the Nazis. Hitler saw it play out, and Hitler said, well, I'm going to do what they did. Mm-hmm. And so we don't ever talk about Hitler, oh, Hitler's a bad dude. Yeah, but Hitler learned from everything that was happening in the U.S. here. And so we have to be mindful, again, when we talk about history, make sure we're calling out the right folk. Yeah. And it's also, like you use the word American, we don't equate U.S. with American. Todos somos americanos from Alaska to the tip of Chile. Todos somos americanos. So that's another thing of us embracing that dominant narrative. That American in this country, it equates white or equates U.S. And so if you're not white, then you have to hyphenate, right? You're Mexican American, you're African American, you're this hyphenation because you're still less than. So it's the psychology. I would say there's psychology in the language. And so why is it that we have to do that? Well, because there's a dominant narrative. Yeah. And I know I say it simplistically, but it's for us to get into this notion of we have to be critical. Because otherwise we're just going to be swept up like you say your family, the MAGA folk, quick sweep up. And it's not to talk less than, in terms of what's happening here, but it's also for us to understand that there was these tools that were intentionally put out there. And I hate to use the word brainwash, but ultimately to brainwash us.
Yeah. And it's still going on right now with DeSantis and Abbott. Like, in Florida, there's a movement to dismantle critical race theory or actual education. Psychology is being dismantled, or AP psychology. And even recently, there's been an approval of having PragerU videos. Yeah. One where like they talk about how slavery was a better option than rather killing enslaved people. And, we still got to acknowledge that it's not something in the past. It's still going on and it's worsening. Yeah. We really have to work to dismantle those structures and fight those people. Like, not in a physical way, but in the sense of using knowledge in the way that it needs to be used.
And that's why we're extremely lucky to have Dr. Rivas here in the IE, doing the work and doing fantastic work around this sphere specifically, right? So thank you so much, Dr. Rivas, for joining us today.
Thank you.
I've learned a lot. I need to go back and watch this video so I can go back and take some notes because I feel like there's a lot to digest and to bring back to my home and talk to my family. And I'm sure all of us here can attest to that. But before we go, can you tell people how they can find you and your work, and if there's any maybe book recommendations you have for the community listening?
If they follow me, if folks follow me on Instagram, it's at DRA, so Doctora Marta with an H. CRT, so Dr. Marta at CRT, which is Critical Race Theorist. I usually post books of like what I'm speaking on. I do offer I call them critical pláticas for community members to be able to talk about these issues: racism, internalized racism, familismo, right? Like there's some concepts of familismo, like we think they're always positive strengths, but there's also toxicity within familias. So let's be okay talking about that. So I talk about a whole lot of other topics, but they can follow me on Instagram. Pláticas are open to everybody. And again, just books, todo, everything's available there because it's about sharing knowledge.
Awesome. Alejandro, anything you want to say before we send it off?
Honestly, if you can, please, by all means, like have these conversations with your family. Like, speak to your friends. Like, if you have a friend who says some, harmful stuff, like please call them in. Don't call them out. Mm-hmm. Like have a interpersonal communication with them where they could grow and you could grow. This work doesn't just end at a podcast. It doesn't just end at like your school or workplace. It continues everywhere.
Yeah, we hope people can use this podcast to start those conversations, listen to the wise words of Dr. Rivas, and hopefully have those really hard conversations with your loved ones, because we can all use this in the Latino community. So thank you once again, Dr. Rivas, and we'll see y'all for the next episode. Thank you. Cool. So good. Cool.